You have no doubts that this president is not a threat to democracy, is not dangerous, is not unhinged.
During an interview with the Fox Propaganda Network, a visibly panicked Nikki Haley sounded the alarm about the failures of the Trump campaign and then gave a disturbing non-answer when asked by Fox about whether Trump was a threat to democracy. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we got a couple of clips to look at in this video, and we're actually going to start with the big one first. Like, all of these clips are really interesting, and I think they say a lot about the current state of the Trump campaign and the 2024 election, and the Nikki Haley contingent of Republican voters who really don't like Donald Trump. But for context, I just want to say, Nikki Haley used to work for Donald Trump in the Trump administration as his United Nations ambassador, okay? Before that, she was a Republican governor of South Carolina. So she's a Republican governor of South Carolina. She worked in the Trump administration as his UN ambassador. Then she campaigned against him in the 2023 Republican primary. She was the last woman standing against Trump before ultimately dipping out earlier in 2024. And then eventually she formally endorsed Donald Trump after many public remarks against him towards the end of the campaign. She dragged her feet criticizing him. Then finally she took the gloves off, and then she backed out. And she said he'd have to earn her endorsement. And then she finally publicly endorsed him. But they seem to have a very frosty relationship. That's the context for all of this. And Bret Baier of Fox News asked Nikki Haley a very important question. And I want you to note the disturbing non-answer Nikki Haley gives.
And lastly, very quickly, because tonight we're going to hear a lot about it, you have no doubts that this president is not a threat to democracy, is not dangerous, is not unhinged, that they will hear tonight.
Look, you don't have to agree with his style. His style and his wording isn't always the best, but his policies, I am choosing policy over personality.
That is a very disturbing non-answer. That is fundamentally no different than when Governor Tim Walz asked J.D. Vance during their vice presidential debate if Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. That was a similar non-answer from Nikki Haley. She could have said, no, of course not. Bret Baier, Bret, I have my disagreements with Donald Trump. I do not like aspects of his personality. There are reasons that I campaigned against him in the Republican primary. He is not perfect. I do disagree with him on major things. However, I prefer his policy to Vice President Kamala Harris's, and I think that he is not a threat to democracy, because if he were a threat to democracy, I would not be supporting him. She could have said something like that. She'd be lying, but she could have said something like that. And instead, she didn't answer the question at all. His personality sucks, but I prefer his policy. Yeah, but is he a threat to democracy? These two things are not mutually exclusive. Like, you can still prefer his policy and he be a threat to democracy. There's nothing inherently mutually exclusive about that. So that answer was extremely disturbing. It was extremely unsatisfying. And I imagine many Nikki Haley supporters who are probably looking for some sort of permission structure to vote for Donald Trump were not encouraged by what Nikki Haley had to say there, because what they want to hear is, no, of course not. Of course he's not a threat to democracy. Of course he's not dangerous. Of course he's not unhinged. And she can't say that with a straight face. So here's some other clips from Nikki Haley.
They were right to denounce the comedian. They need to go and tell Puerto Ricans how much, they do value them. They need to tell Latinos that, but they also need to look at how they're talking about women. I mean, this bromance and this masculinity stuff, it borders on edgy to the point that it's going to make women uncomfortable. You've got affiliated PACs that are doing commercials about calling Kamala the C word, or you had speakers at Madison Square Gardens, referring to her and her pimps. That is not the way to win women. That is not the way to win people who are concerned about Trump's style. This is a time to talk about the economy. This is the time to talk about immigration. This is the time to talk about national security. And this is the time to talk about Kamala Harris. They were right.
So let's talk about that for a second. I should have had that pulled up, and I'm going to look it up here real quick while we're talking. But Nikki Haley is right in the sense that, as we've discussed, there is a historic gender gap that Donald Trump is actually on the wrong side of. So many people talk about Vice President Harris and the Democrats' struggle with male voters. And it's true that they do struggle. They are hemorrhaging, voters among men. And it's something, quite frankly, that the Democratic Party needs to address. But Donald Trump is actually in a worse situation with women than Democrats are with men. Okay. And nobody talks about it except Nikki Haley, or Megyn Kelly, who want Donald Trump to win. And they recognize this vulnerability and they don't think the Trump campaign is actually working to address it. Now, while we're on the subject, what she's talking about is the America PAC led by Elon Musk, Donald Trump's top surrogate. They actually made a post, an ad against Vice President Harris. They've since deleted it, but it said this: America really can't afford a C word in the White House right now. Vote today, vote safe. And of course, Kamala Harris is a C word. Now, apparently, the irony is, or the joke is, the punchline is they were referring to communist instead of, the more incendiary C word. Kamala Harris is neither of these things. Kamala Harris is not the C word. Kamala Harris is not a communist. Okay, so it was a lie and slanderous either way. And after enormous backlash, as Midas Touch reported, Elon Musk quietly deletes the post from his pro-Trump PAC. Okay, this was a huge misstep. This was a huge miscalculation. Quite frankly, people should be talking about it even more. Here's another clip from Nikki Haley's interview with Fox.
So when you look at these things, it has got to be a story of addition. This is not a time to have anyone criticize Puerto Rico or Latinos. This is not a time for them to get overly masculine with this bromance thing that they've got going. 53% of the electorate are women. Women will vote. They care about how they're being talked to, and they care about the issues. They need to remember that. This is a time of discipline, and this is a time of addition.
And Donald Trump's campaign is not interested in that. They seem to believe that they can get by just fine with the male vote because, again, to whatever extent you want to criticize the Democratic Party for, neglecting men, and that's a fair criticism to make. Again, Donald Trump is just doing objectively worse with women who comprise a majority of the people in this country and a majority of the voters in this country, and they are more reliable voters than men. It's just absolute nonsense, politically speaking. Of course, I'm happy to see him fail with women because it increases the likelihood that he loses, and I really want him to lose. But Nikki Haley doesn't, which is why, again, she's sounding the alarm. One last clip from the Nikki Haley interview in which, again, she reveals that even though she's endorsed Donald Trump, even though she has publicly said she is at Donald Trump's disposal, Donald Trump is still holding a grudge against Haley because he still has not reached out to her.
And so I don't agree with Trump 100% of the time, but I don't agree with Kamala Harris on anything.
The Harris campaign is utilizing some Republicans who've come to support her, including former Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Clearly, a lot of analysts think they're going after voters who supported you in the primary. The Associated Press says, as Democrats court Haley supporters, the former UN ambassador is still waiting to hear from Trump. When was the last time you talked to the former president?
Last time I talked to him was back in June.
So are you surprised that you haven't been deployed out to campaign, or have you volunteered to go out and campaign for him directly?
I mean, they're very aware that we're on standby. They know that we would be there to help. I've helped with some fundraising letters and text messages and those types of things. So we've done that. But look, we're on the same team. It is their campaign's decision on what he needs in these last final days. It does not bother me at all. I think they need to do what they need to do to get across the finish line. I just think that they need to focus primarily on who it is they're talking to. And so
you can tell that Bret Baier was stunned.
Out to campaign, or have you volunteered to go out from Trump? When was the last time you talked to the former president?
Last time I talked to him was back in June.
So are you...
That pregnant pause, stunning, right? Very stupid of Trump not to try to bring Nikki Haley into the fold, but that's Donald Trump for you. He doesn't, he has, there's no masterful strategy. To the extent that the Trump campaign has been successful, it has been in spite of Donald Trump's impulses and his instincts. And because of the, it's actually attributable to the success of Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles and the disciplined Trump campaign staff who have to work with the least disciplined campaign candidate in American history. Really interesting stuff. Again, note the worry in Nikki Haley's voice, noted on her face. She sees the mistakes that the Trump campaign are making, which could potentially cost them the election. And hopefully it will. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.